Of Buckingham Palace have heard secrets before, but nothing like this. When King Charles was caught on a hot mic, uttering the haunting words, "She was never honest," the shockwaves didn't just stay behind palace doors. They exploded across the globe. Who was he talking about? Why now? And how did Meghan Markle's name become the epicenter of this royal earthquake? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the moment seemed like a slip, one of those unguarded remarks made in exhaustion after a tense conversation. Charles had just concluded a private meeting, attended by only a handful of senior royals and palace staff. As he exited the room, still visibly agitated, he muttered those now infamous words under his breath. Unbeknownst to him, a nearby boom mic left active by a media team covering a separate royal initiative picked up the phrase clearly. She was never honest. 6 words that would shake the very foundation of the monarchy. Within hours, the palace was in crisis mode. Senior aides scrambled to contain the situation, fearing the media would catch wind of the audio. But it was too late. A freelance technician had already leaked the clip to a popular tabloid. And just like that, the phrase became the headline, plastered across newspapers, television screens, and social media feeds around the world. Who had Charles been talking about? What had pushed the king to such a raw moment of truth? All eyes turned to Meghan Markle. The once beloved Duchess of Sussex had long been at the center of controversy, praised by supporters as a modern force for change and vilified by critics as a destabilizing outsider. The divide had always been sharp, but now it cut deeper. For supporters, Charles' words were the latest example of an institution refusing to protect a vulnerable woman. For others, it was confirmation of suspicions they had carried for years. Palace insiders refused to comment. But behind closed doors, they weren't just stunned. They were rattled. According to sources close to royal advisors, this wasn't the first time Charles had expressed serious concerns. For years, he had bitten his tongue in public, trying to maintain unity for the sake of his family and the crown. But something had shifted. And this wasn't just about Meghan, it was about the impact of trust lost, of reputations tarnished, of a kingdom held hostage by conflict. Meanwhile, the royal family carried on with public appearances, but their faces betrayed the storm brewing within. Catherine, usually poised and warm, appeared colder. William, distant. Anne, silent. The emotional cost was written into every wave, every smile, every glance toward a camera. And still, no official statement. No retraction. No denial. The silence only fueled the fire. The public wanted answers. The media wanted blood. And the palace? They simply wanted to survive. But this wasn't the first time questions had been raised about honesty in the House of Windsor. What followed was a harrowing return to moments the monarchy hoped would stay buried. To the world, Meghan Markle was the fresh face of modern royalty. But behind the elegant gowns and picture-perfect smiles lay a maze of isolation. Private complaints and whispers of manipulation. Were her struggles genuine cries for help, or part of a much larger strategy? At first, the palace embraced her with cautious optimism. A breath of fresh air, they said, a woman of grace, eloquence, and independence. But behind closed doors, Meghan reportedly began to feel suffocated by the unspoken rules of royal life. From the rigid protocols to the unrelenting glare of the British press, she began to voice her frustrations early on. Yet the way she expressed them was different from what the firm was used to. Her grievances didn't come in quiet counsel, they came with confrontation, sometimes fury, and increasingly with consequences. By the time her first year inside the royal fold had passed, rumors of tension were beginning to surface. One by one, staff members began leaving, some abruptly, others after months of private distress. The media called it the Meghan effect. But inside the palace, the whispers turned darker. Multiple aides, who had once praised her energy and charisma, now described an environment of emotional unpredictability. She could be charming and poised in the morning, and by afternoon, reportedly cold and accusatory. Some felt as though they were walking on glass, never sure what version of Meghan they would face that day. The conflict with Catherine, though rarely discussed publicly, had begun to boil long before the media got hold of it. A tense argument during wedding preparations would later become one of the most polarizing scandals in royal memory. Meghan insisted she had cried. Catherine, ever the peacemaker, said little. But behind palace walls, the Queen herself had been made aware of the tension, and she wasn't pleased. Not with the argument, but with how it had been handled. It was the first indication that Meghan didn't just clash with staff. She clashed with the hierarchy itself. Unbeknownst to many, Meghan had begun journaling. Not just about her experiences, but about what she perceived as injustices, coldness, and power plays. Some entries, according to insiders, would later appear nearly word for word in interviews and public statements. They weren't merely reflections, they were records, evidence, insurance, and perhaps, some feared, weapons. In response, senior royals began documenting their own interactions. Meetings, messages, offhand comments. Everything was now recorded, even if only mentally. The once close family dinners turned into strained affairs. Trust, that fragile thread holding together centuries of legacy, was beginning to fray. What had started as an effort to modernize the monarchy was quickly becoming a source of division so deep that not even the Queen's measured presence could mend it. The smiling Duchess that appeared in public was, by many accounts, at odds with the woman behind palace gates. And while some still gave her the benefit of the doubt, others had started to prepare for the worst. As pressure mounted, one figure in the shadows began keeping detailed notes, a royal aide, who would later become the key to unlocking the truth. For years, it was just speculation. But then came the diary. A former palace aide's handwritten journal, leaked anonymously, paints a devastating portrait of deception, manipulation, and staged breakdowns. And what it claims about Meghan sent the firm into full-blown crisis mode. The leak wasn't loud, it was precise. A manila envelope slipped quietly into the hands of a senior royal correspondent. No fingerprints, no return address. Inside, page after page of dated entries, meticulously recorded, written in the hand of someone who had clearly been watching for a long time. Not a tabloid exposé, not an act of revenge, this was something more chilling. A chronicle of control from the inside out. The entries were damning. One passage described a moment where Meghan allegedly arranged a breakdown just hours before a royal dinner tears, shouting, retreating to her room, only to re-emerge minutes later in full glam, beaming at photographers. The aide wrote that the timing was never random. These breakdowns, they claimed, often coincided with tensions in negotiations, high-profile events, or moments when the Duchess wanted to reset the public narrative. What was most disturbing wasn't the emotion, it was the precision. According to the diary, Meghan had what the aide referred to as control points. Moments she used to reshape perception and influence royal dynamics. Many entries highlighted her strategy of using Harry as a shield. Whenever staff raised concerns, they said, Meghan would send Harry in first. He would defend, protect, and push back on anything critical, because he believed her entirely. The journal also referenced Meghan's so-called exit plan. A calculated path, the aide wrote, designed to ensure her relevance beyond the palace. Meetings with PR consultants, whispers of brand deals, secret calls with American producers. One line read simply, "She's not just marrying the prince, she's rewriting the ending." The aide even claimed Meghan discussed structuring her journey to be Netflix-friendly, dramatic arcs, redemption narratives, and behind-the-scenes exclusives no one else could offer. But perhaps the most alarming revelation was a vision that terrified the traditionalists in the royal household, an alleged plan to rebrand the monarchy around herself. She wanted to be seen not just as a duchess, the diary claimed, but as a global icon. One passage chillingly quoted Meghan as saying, "They need to change with me, or I'll make them irrelevant." Timing is everything. The leak of this diary came just days before Charles was caught on that hot mic. Coincidence? Unlikely. Insiders believe someone inside the palace, perhaps even with the king's blessing, decided enough was enough. The leak was a warning shot, a signal that the crown was done playing defense, But even as this secret diary circulated among select palace insiders, it would be one emotional moment between Charles and Harry that truly broke the silence. It was supposed to be a reconciliation, but it turned into a reckoning. Behind closed doors, Charles confronted Harry. The words exchanged that day haven't all been made public, but insiders reveal it ended with trembling hands, raised voices, and a single chilling phrase. "You don't even know her." What began as a father's gentle request quickly spiraled into emotional warfare. Charles had summoned Harry for a private walk on the grounds of Balmoral. He hoped, or perhaps naively believed, that away from the media, away from courtiers and consultants, he might finally reach the son he no longer recognized. But Charles wasn't walking into this meeting empty-handed. He had the aide's diary in his pocket, a growing file of internal complaints, and a heart heavy with silence that had stretched far too long. Harry listened at first, but it wasn't long before Charles raised the topic that had to be raised. The accusations, the breakdowns, the diary, and the perception that Meghan had been orchestrating something far more complex than emotional distress. Charles asked, not accused, but that was enough. The moment the word manipulation left Charles's mouth, Harry recoiled as if struck. The bridge between them, already brittle, began to burn. "You've chosen the image over the truth," Harry snapped, his voice rising, the pain raw. He accused Charles of never protecting them, of letting the press and the palace cannibalize his wife's name for the sake of tradition. But Charles, worn and wounded, pushed back not as a king, but as a father desperate to pull back the veil. "She's not who she pretends to be," he said. "And you know it. Deep down, you do." That sentence hung in the air like smoke after a blast. Harry's expression, insiders say, turned cold. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, his words were final. "Then I'm done with the crown. With all of this." And, just like that, he walked away, leaving Charles standing on the same path where he once taught his son to ride a pony. But there were no more lessons to give. Back at the palace, the fallout was instant. Charles returned, shaken. Aides, who had grown used to royal composure, saw something different in their king, a man devastated, unsure if he had saved his son or lost him forever. Morale plummeted across royal offices. Staff who had spent years trying to shield the public from internal tension could no longer deny what had become brutally obvious. The royal family wasn't fractured, it was bleeding. And yet, it wasn't over. Far from it. Because while Charles wrestled with heartbreak and Harry retreated into silence, Meghan was preparing for something that would change everything. What happened next would ignite a war of image versus truth, love versus loyalty, and the most damaging interview in royal history was just days away. When Harry and Meghan sat down for their explosive tell-all interview, they thought they were finally setting the record straight. But insiders now claim that it wasn't just what was said, it was what was left out that shattered what little trust remained inside the palace. The world stopped to watch. Over 60 million viewers tuned in, their eyes locked on two figures who had once walked proudly beneath the banners of Buckingham Palace, but now sat across from Oprah Winfrey, poised to unveil what they claimed were years of pain, neglect, and discrimination. For many, it was the reckoning they'd long awaited, a dismantling of an outdated institution. But for the monarchy, it was a carefully staged ambush. Meghan didn't hold back. With a trembling voice and composed delivery, she accused unnamed members of the royal family of making comments about her unborn child's skin tone. She spoke of isolation, of being silenced, of being denied help when she needed it most. She claimed that, within the palace walls, there was no protection, only control. Harry, equally emotional, spoke of being trapped within the system, of watching history repeat itself, and of his decision to prioritize his family over his role. The interview hit the royal family like a thunderclap. It wasn't just the content, it was the fact that they were blindsided. No notice, no warning, no opportunity to respond. Senior aides scrambled to contain the press, while advisors worked through the night, drafting potential statements. Charles was reportedly stunned, not just by the accusations, but by the portrayal of a family he believed he had spent his life protecting. William and Catherine, who had already been publicly implicated through subtle nods and omissions, now found themselves painted as passive aggressors in a royal Cold War. But as the world clung to every word, experts began picking apart the timeline. Certain claims didn't align. Dates overlapped awkwardly. Statements previously made by the couple contradicted what was now being said on air. The inconsistencies, once minor, started stacking up. And inside the palace, quiet fury brewed. Meghan's version of events didn't match internal records, and more importantly, didn't match private conversations known to key insiders. To stem the bleeding, William and Catherine made a surprise walkabout the very next day. Their appearance wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. A calm, composed Catherine offered smiles and nods, while William, for the first time in public, directly addressed the racism claim. "We're very much not a racist family," he said, his voice sharp with disappointment. The Queen, ever the master of restraint, issued a brief statement that said everything and nothing. The issues raised, particularly that of race, are concerning. While some recollections may vary, they are taken very seriously and will be addressed privately. It was a subtle blow, a reminder that behind every public drama, the monarchy still moved with deliberate, strategic force. But even as the world picked sides, the monarchy prepared a silent counterattack, and it would come in the form of a carefully timed leak. It was never supposed to see the light of day. A letter, written by Charles but never sent, expressing everything he couldn't say aloud about Meghan and the fallout. But when it surfaced in a secret drop to a journalist, it proved what many feared. The king had reached his breaking point. The letter was never meant for public eyes. It was drafted in the aftermath of the televised interview that tore through the monarchy's foundation. Charles, overwhelmed by the storm brewing around his family, had poured his anguish into words that were brutally honest, heartbreakingly raw, and politically dangerous. It was a father's confession, a monarch's reckoning, and an undeniable reflection of how far things had spiraled out of control. In the letter, Charles referred to Meghan not with anger, but with exhausted clarity. He called her calculating, not out of spite, but from observation. "She is extraordinarily skilled," he wrote, "at making herself the victim of any room she walks into." The line wasn't vindictive. It was cold, controlled. The kind of sentence that reveals years of watching, withholding, and finally surrendering to the truth no one dared speak aloud. What struck the most was Charles's depiction of his own helplessness. "I watched my son vanish before my eyes," he penned, "not all at once, but piece by piece. The man I once knew disappeared beneath layers of paranoia, self-righteousness, and a loyalty that no longer extended to his family." It was the clearest admission yet that Harry, in Charles's view, hadn't just stepped away from royal life, he'd been pulled from it. The letter hinted at even darker corners of the palace conflict. Charles referenced what he called staged emotional episodes, moments he believed were carefully crafted by Meghan to shift public sympathy. "She knew when to cry," he wrote, "and who to cry in front of." He described the palace being held hostage by fear. Fear of what might be revealed, twisted, or weaponized next. He even noted private threats, veiled, indirect, but unmistakable if things didn't go her way behind the scenes. What made the letter truly devastating, however, wasn't just its contents, but its validation. The journalist who received it anonymously didn't publish it immediately. They took the time to verify the handwriting, the envelope, even the watermark of the royal stationery. 3 sources within the palace confirmed it was real, written in Charles's own hand, dated only weeks before the infamous hot mic incident. A ticking bomb that had remained hidden until someone decided it was time for the world to see the king's unfiltered truth. And there, at the very bottom of the final page, it ended with the phrase that now haunted every corridor of the monarchy. "She was never honest, not to me, not to him, not to us." In work, suddenly, those whispered words caught on the hot mic made horrifying sense, and the public turned their eyes to Meghan for a response she couldn't dodge. For days, she said nothing. But when Meghan finally broke her silence, it wasn't an apology. It was a counteroffensive. Tearful, angry, and armed with her own receipts, she claimed betrayal at the highest level. But this time, something had changed. The public wasn't buying it. The silence was strategic. As media outlets across the globe dissected the leaked letter from King Charles, speculation intensified. Every hour without a response was interpreted as guilt. Advisors urged restraint, but the pressure became unbearable. Meghan had never been one to sit quietly while the storm raged around her. And so, from the controlled calm of her Montecito estate, she released a statement visually pristine, emotionally charged, and devastatingly direct. In the video, Meghan denounced the palace for what she called a systematic campaign of misinformation and character assassination. She claimed the leaked letter had been selectively edited to paint her as a villain, accusing the monarchy of twisting private conversations and exploiting family pain to regain public favor. The tone was firm, but the tears were real, or at least they appeared to be. Her voice cracked as she spoke of being hunted, misunderstood, and discarded. But Meghan didn't stop there. For the first time, she directly implicated Charles in emotional abuse, painting him as a cold, manipulative force behind palace walls. She implied that his letter was not a revelation, but a retaliation. "This isn't a letter from a father," she said. "It's a weapon from a king who never saw me as family." Her words were pointed, her delivery sharp. It was war. But this time, it wasn't just between Meghan and the crown. It was between Meghan and the world. What made the situation spiral wasn't her statement. It was the visible unease from Harry, who sat beside her in near silence throughout the video. His body language was unreadable. His gaze rarely met the camera. And when Meghan spoke of Charles, Harry's only visible reaction was a deep, pained inhale. The public noticed. So did royal watchers. For the first time, people began questioning whether the prince believed the very story he helped tell. Then came the pushback. A former palace aide, one who had previously remained anonymous, released a trove of internal messages and documents. These records, time-stamped and verified, contradicted significant elements of Meghan's narrative. One message even confirmed that Meghan had approved the exact wording of a communication she now claimed had been distorted. The effect was immediate. Public opinion, once sharply divided, began to shift. Online support for Meghan softened. Polls showed a steep drop in her credibility, especially among younger demographics who had previously championed her. What had once been her strength, her ability to command sympathy and control the narrative, was now cracking. Her voice, once seen as liberating, was being re-examined under a far more critical lens. The monarchy, long accused of manipulation, had turned the tide by revealing just enough to cast doubt, yet withholding enough to keep the world guessing. And just as the dust began to settle, a bombshell internal audit would reignite the scandal, leaving no room for denial. Buried deep within palace archives was a classified internal audit, an investigation into royal conduct, media leaks, and internal manipulation. When it was leaked to a senior advisor, its findings would change everything. And at the center of it all, one name repeated over 200 times: Meghan Markle. The audit had been commissioned quietly in 2019. It wasn't publicly known, not even to many within the palace. It was triggered by a series of complaints filed by senior staff who had either resigned or requested transfer. Their departure was dismissed at the time as personal or coincidental, but behind the scenes, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The complaints weren't just about stress, they were about a specific individual and the environment they claimed she fostered. The report laid it all bare. 14 official staff complaints were logged against Meghan, all detailed, all supported by internal messages and witness statements. The language was stark accusations of verbal intimidation, gaslighting, emotional manipulation, and deliberate undermining of traditional palace structures. Some of the incidents, according to the report, had escalated so far that staff were required to undergo psychological counseling after leaving their roles. A climate of fear, one section concluded, had settled over the Sussex team, and it was spreading. More alarming were the communications. The audit confirmed that Meghan had coordinated media messaging without palace approval, engaging with external PR firms, leaking curated information to sympathetic journalists, and in one instance, reportedly approving the release of a document just hours before the palace's official statement on the same issue. It created confusion, division, and most damaging of all contradictions that made the monarchy look either dishonest or disorganized. Meghan, the report claimed, had effectively built her own press machine inside the palace. But it didn't stop at PR. The audit also uncovered efforts subtle, but persistent to marginalize certain senior royals. Internal communications revealed that Meghan had expressed discomfort with the roles of both Camilla and Princess Anne, allegedly describing them as outdated and a threat to progressive branding. She had reportedly tried to minimize their presence in events and internal meetings, even proposing changes to ceremonial seating orders and public schedules that would reposition her closer to the Queen. When those suggestions were denied, tensions reportedly deepened. The final section of the report, signed by the lead investigator, summarized its conclusion in one line that left no room for ambiguity. There is a documented and recurring pattern of strategic dishonesty, orchestrated influence, and personal ambition that conflicts with the values and operations of the royal institution. When this document reached the desk of a senior advisor, weeks after Meghan's televised rebuttal, and just days after the letter leak, it was no longer just an internal file. It was evidence. And although it was never officially released to the public, its contents were shared with key figures within the royal circle. The walls of the palace, already shaking under the weight of revelations, now had something concrete to stand behind. For some, it was vindication. For others, it was betrayal made visible. And in a final emotional moment before a stunned crowd, King Charles would step forward, not just as monarch, but as father, and speak the words that would define a generation. Standing before the nation, King Charles didn't hold back. With his voice shaking, he confirmed what so many feared and what some refused to believe. Meghan, he declared, had not only broken trust, but fractured the very soul of the monarchy. And his final words? They still echo through the halls of power. It was supposed to be a routine state visit, another day of ceremony, speeches, and public unity. But as the press gathered and crowds waited for the usual pageantry, what unfolded instead was something far more raw, far more personal. In front of cameras, flanked by senior members of the royal family, Charles stepped forward, not as sovereign, but as a father laid bare. His speech began with the customary diplomatic gratitude, but then it shifted, and the world held its breath. Charles spoke not just of duty and legacy, but of betrayal. He described the past few years as a relentless unraveling of familial unity, and admitted that behind palace walls, they had struggled not with modernity, but with deception. Without naming names, he traced the arc of their suffering. But then, breaking from the script entirely, he delivered the line no one thought a monarch would ever dare say in public. What she brought into our family was not change, it was chaos cloaked in charm. The shock rippled instantly. And it didn't end there. Charles declared that the monarchy had endured enough. He confirmed, for the first time on record, that Meghan's actions had destroyed royal integrity from the inside out. And while he did not spare Harry from responsibility, his tone softened only slightly when referencing his son. "I mourn the son I raised," he said, "and I pray for the man he's become." He then turned to the future. With a solemn expression, Charles voiced his full support for a restructured, streamlined monarchy. One that would now be publicly led by Prince William and Princess Catherine. It was more than symbolic. It was a passing of power sealed not by celebration, but by the fallout of betrayal. "This institution will no longer be shaped by those who use it," he declared. "It will be led by those who serve it." And then came the blow that turned the speech into history. Until the truth is honored, there will be no role, formal or informal, for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex in this monarchy. The line was final, and it cut deeper than any royal decree in recent memory. But Charles wasn't finished. His eyes, now heavy with grief, scanned the room before he delivered the closing words that have since been quoted around the globe. "She was never honest. I just couldn't see it." The silence that followed said more than applause ever could. In that moment, it wasn't just a king speaking, it was a father broken, a leader reckoning with the legacy he would leave behind. But as Britain adjusts to a royal future without reconciliation, one truth remains. Honesty isn't just a virtue in the monarchy, it's survival. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.